I enjoy where we have been as part of the movement. To come back anytime, to walk the streets, to meet the people, to see the things, because it brings back all that's important. And to be in Memphis, very important. There was something came up here about the great music of the city on one hand, and the great sadness of it on the other. The joy on one hand, the sadness on the other. The difficulties that were here that were set aside on one hand, and the other kind that followed it. And we live in a kind of world where that we still all need the same things to happen in our unity together in a very special way. And I suppose that leads me on into where I wanted to go. And I know it does because I have it written down. I want to talk about this American hero, this more than hero, this American person who became the voice and the conscience of this nation. And I want to talk about it in a little different way, because when we really see it, I want to talk about Martin King as a model of spiritual leadership. Is that the great futurist of this country said right before the change of the century, he said that there's three things that will have to happen in the coming century. And two of them doesn't matter to us. But the third one is tremendously important because it grows out of our work and who we are and what we have done in our past that calls us to be present for the continuing of the century. Is that when he as a futurist said that one of the things that we must do is to follow up on our creating spiritual leadership. Now he said this after, and that's what's so important about it. There's never been, none of the futurists has ever talked about something like that, right? And he puts it in and it's challenging to all of us because after we saw the movement, Martin King, the leadership of so many that came forward, and all the people's movements that were happening as a consequence, is that this, and when we look at them, they're not normal. They have something extra. It's about how you love people. One of the ones out of Cuba said, what we must remember that revolutionaries love people. It's always this love of people that makes the difference. The basic understanding of our spirituality. This third one is important for us because it involves all of us. It calls us to what we have been doing in the past and rethink it, because if it wasn't for spiritual leadership, we wouldn't be here tonight. Is that if it wasn't for spiritual leadership, something different would go on and would have been going on, and we probably would not have won the greatest struggle of the past, not decade, but of the century. The people's movements during the past century was leading us up to this, all right? Is that we're not involved in a short-term struggle. This struggle seems that it will take us at least 2 centuries to do. And it calls for, as we used to say, long-term runners, right? Now, the point being is that we are they who have taken it to this point. And we must be willing to go all the way. I'm 85, right? People say to me is that, well, look, Vivian, when are you going to retire? I said, retire? The car's out there and the tires are good enough. And we have to understand that this futurist could only state that after he had seen who we were and had seen Martin Luther King as a model for our century as well. I used to have a standard speech, you don't tell them it's standard until after, But it was Martin King, 21st century man. Because what we were doing was laying the basis for the 21st century. That's what we were doing in the 20th century. The last half of the 20th century was laying a basis for the future. And the real issue is, can we be a part of it in such a way that we go beyond the century that we're in right now to the next one? Is that when we look at the gains we've made, I didn't think that we would have a black president for at least 2 more generations, right? Is that, but all of a sudden, we have a black president. And he comes so fast that he even gets the Nobel Peace Prize before his major victories have come. Right? Another way of saying it is he's gone all over the world, that it is not just we, it is the world that is desiring a change that makes sense. And when we see this type of leadership, we have to remember that we controlled the last half of the 20th century. We really controlled it. It could not move without us. We made it come to itself. And thank you. We made it come to itself. It was we who did that. And we did it without guns, and we did it without violence, and we did it denying that those were necessary for our relationships. And we were dealing with the basic problems underneath the ones that we could talk about by the way that we did it. It is the method that was more important than what we were really doing. It was difficult for us to see that at first, but Martin King had already seen it. And when Martin arrived, because we were all looking for something very real to happen, we were stuck in our old customs and traditions from our past, knew that we needed something far more because our sense of our own humanity was not being decided and dealt with in a way that would make us full. We knew it. All we needed was the leadership. What kind of leadership would that leadership be? And the only kind that seemed to work out is spiritual leadership. Martin represented it more than any other. Is that President Johnson understood it when he said that the most important single piece of legislation of our time was the voting rights bill. And it came out of our leadership. It came out of our power, our backing, all right? It did not come from the normal sources, and it didn't come from what was called power of our time. They had it happen to them instead of that making things happen to us. And for the first time, we could decide what we wanted to do, what we wanted to become for a long time, right? And we were not fooled into thinking that what we were doing was less than, but realized it was far more than any leadership we had before was going to give us. This is why we could believe in this president who could speak to the idea that that we could move regardless of any other circumstance. Money was no longer a problem because we found out how to do that ourselves, all right? So we could outbid the millionaires in terms of placing people in our political offices. The world was changing. We have been changing it on every hand, and we must use it throughout the period that we're in now. Is that later on the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Martin King, and the important thing for me in there that we don't normally think of is the fact that that Eisenhower said that he would exchange his medals, right, for that medal. Now, most important, because here is military leadership at the highest level saying that far more important than my military stuff would be the social victories that must come. He understood that, right? And when we look at who got it, it's the spiritual leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. When Martin moved into Montgomery, Alabama, is that the governor of that state was head of racism in the South. And they moved right across the street from each other. Is that Martin's church, Dexter Avenue, was right across from the Capitol. And when we look at that, they could look out their windows and see each other, so to speak, right across the street. It was the classic struggle for the Bible between the king and the prophet. There was always that struggle going on. It's a part of the mainstream part of the history that we see when we look at Jewish history through the scriptures, right? Is that struggle goes on all the time, because that's the struggle between power as conceived by a few for themselves over and against the power that we must have of the many in order to have that which can satisfy our inner sense of being and what we want to do and be and become. Because we cannot do what we want to do, become who we want to become, until in fact the masses of us are in charge of us. And this nation has talked about democracy, but you see, we've had very little of it when those that are in power only got there because of money and kept it because of money. And we see right now that we are faced with the same kind of thing when the president makes all the sense in the world about health care for all of us, all right? And it makes all the sense when we see the rest of the world can do it. We spend more money, but we can't deal with logic. And it's only because we have not amassed enough people to overcome it. What with nonviolence we could do, for instance, is that because the real core understanding is to reach the conscience of the nation. Is if 1 million people not marched on Washington, but rolled their wheelchairs on Washington, right? You understand what I'm saying, right? It's reaching the conscience. When we really have people come who have lost their homes, we're talking about still maintaining the Martin King movement. We're talking about how we reach nonviolently the very conscience of the nation and win people because they out there knowing what should be done, they do not have the leadership for it. And that spiritual leadership that's so deeply concerned about all the people is the only thing that can change what we're up against now. Is that we got Obama almost by accident. And what I'm really, and it always bothers me since then, because I'm thinking is that nonviolent movement should never allow another president by accident. You see what I mean? No politician should go in by accident. It should be that we conceive not who the person is, but what kind of person we will allow to govern us. It's happening all over the world. We thought we already had it done. But we really realized from the last 8 years, and realized from what is happening now, and realized that we are more powerful than we thought. You know, it is interesting, once we won the civil rights movement, we went and sat down. So it's not the young generation that's the problem. It was we gave up on them before they were even out there because we thought we had done so much we could sit down and it would just happen. Right? Well, it'll never just happen. And if we don't fight for it, what we're saying is we are not worthy of having it. Right? The struggle is proven. The struggle is proven actually by what we do, not what we talk about. It's in the action that we find out who we are. It's in the action we find out what our nation is like. And solutions come only serendipity up out of the action. And that's who we are. We are the people of action. And that's why we won. The last half of the last century is because we were in action. Without that action, nothing really happens in favor of the masses of people. Problem is, again, is that we would not have to go through what we're going through now if we had started early enough. When we really think about it, the only reason nonviolence doesn't really win is because we start too late. You know, it's a slow method. Right? Is that you have to win people nicely. It's, you know, with a gun, you just say, will you go with me? But in nonviolence, you really have to take people seriously, all of them, right? And this is the way you win permanently. That's what nonviolence is all about. That's what Martin King was about. That's what spiritual leadership is about. You so honor people that, and your arguments are so sound that they have no other choice, and you don't have much because you know that you are right. And it's that knowing that you are right, it's that sense of righteousness that comes out of struggle that makes the difference. Is that, in fact, spiritual leadership has been with us a lot longer than we've talked about it. I was thinking about just the African American, colored, black, which one you want, right? Is thinking about that whole history, and I ran across a new thing for me, and you know we think we, you know, but we don't know as much as we think, right? When I began to see, I'm a book collector, and I began to see that at every step in black history is that we were involved in the kind of thing that Martin was doing, only it read to us differently. That every time black people, through slavery and the whole thing, right? Every time that we told our own story, wrote our own story, there were people there that were far beyond the reaches of normal acceptance of what was happening. In fact, it seemed like every time we wrote something for ourselves and published it ourselves, it was about the issue of freedom. Names we know, for instance, when we talk about the man who really did the first almanac, I have one, all right? And and in the one I happen to have, is that in that almanac, is that he talks about a peace office to replace the war office, right? And writes out what the Secretary of Peace should be about, not what the Secretary of War should be about. I thought is that, that was the first time that we had published a piece that we could be accountable for that went out to all the people instead of just black people, right? But in it, he was talking about a peace movement. I call him the first peacenik. At least the first black peacenik, right? Is because of the power of this. But the other day, book came that's going to come out next year. And one of the great historians did the afterword for it. And he says that, that the thing that we have to look at is that African Americans and African American preacher was the first person. See, I never follow these notes really. So and he was the first preacher, Reverend Lemuel Hayes. I have one of the sermons of his, but it's not this one. But he was the first African American. He was the first person, even before the Continental Congress, before Jefferson, before the whole group that we know, he was the first one to actually say all men are created equal. The language of the Constitution he was preaching a decade before, because you really preaching a decade before you ever get a print. All right, is that before it was there, it had come up out of our need when we really begin to see that always spiritual leadership is what has been able to maintain itself long enough to be acted upon and strong enough to win when action came. Is that how do we do that? It becomes very, very clear how it happens, because only spiritual leadership could be a redeeming power for the 400 years that we have suffered on the issue of racism that has continuously kept everybody in this country going backward. How do you do it? See, is that you do it through a spiritual understanding, a spiritual action that makes it so. When we look at it, Martin King moved in Montgomery. When he moved in Montgomery, Alabama, 30,000 black people came out of their churches. The civil rights movement was not done on the corner, right? It came out of our churches. Consistently, our churches gave the leadership for movements of freedom. And it was not only true in the black community, it was true in the white community. The labor movement was started by ministers. Not accepted, so you really don't hear much about them, because they were kicked out of the official religious organizations, but they didn't need them anyway, all right? And they continued to fight the hard struggle for people. And that religious drive, that desire to put up with struggle if necessary, in order for the greater good to happen, was basic to them at every hand. And they brought forward the great people's movements of the time. And those great people's movements lost when they lost their religious fervor. For instance, one of the historians says the only problem with the ship of labor, it got stuck on a reef of mashed potatoes and gravy. Is that one of our organizations that was really a nonviolent organization when it started, the problem is that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right, great courage, great purpose, great drive, they lost it in Mississippi because it got really too rough for the untrained to put their life on the line for. All right? One returned to violence, thinking that would do it, with expressions like by any means necessary. And the good old boys who love guns and love to kill, is that they did not mind telling them that you will have to go, right? And when you going down Mississippi highways, you have to have high-powered cars if you're black, and if you can speak against the norm, because they love to just run you down at night, right? It's a part of the countryside. It's a part of the lifestyle. It's a part of doing it up the way they want it. But nonviolence they cannot handle. And once you learn it, then you know that you're in control of the society if you want to be. Once we know what nonviolence can do, we don't have to put up with anything we don't have to put up with. We just have to organize, organize, organize. All right? And that's what it takes to do it. And when Martin came in and won in Montgomery, his next step was to bring forth ministers from across the South, the best educated and the most powerful across the South that understood social good. And they became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Immediately with the victory, it was no problem in organizing, but you can never keep it in one spot. Real difference between Martin and a number of organizations is that they thought that since they'd done something, they could do it in one place. I know. I was doing nonviolent direct action 9 years before Martin. You know, so I've even had people tell me, then you were so great. You should, well, why don't you go out and organize something now? Because I'm not Martin King, that's right. Just because you start early doesn't mean that you know that you're in great hands, right? It's that Martin was the great one. Is that and probably, and this is what I have to really keep telling young people, is that here is the thing, and that we represent it. But that's the thing that we keep going, because the truth is that Martin King was probably the only minister with a PhD in the South that wasn't that wasn't pastoring. You know, is that he may be in a seminary. But you think about it. I know there wasn't another black one, and I don't think that there were many white ones. Is that the advances since the 1940s have been so great in education that we forget kind of that there was a time right before that that we didn't have nearly the education or the background that we have now, and it can be forgotten in the process. Is that we have to be capable and ready. Is that Martin was starting to bring them together, created SCLC, left Montgomery, went to another location, and began to move clear across America. Is that sense of organizing. We don't have a nonviolent organization that is doing action today. You hear what I'm saying? Yeah. Is that, and it's in the action that we find out what it's all about. No one is really concerned about talk, right? The forces that we're dealing with don't care what we say. They'll probably help you say it. But he was starting to show all of us that spiritual leadership was necessary, and that necessariness became the rule. And Martin's movement helped us free ourselves and helped others be freed up as well. It didn't stop with black people, or it didn't stop with a few of us, right? Is that it was there for everybody to join in the action. Is that the follow-up of it was most important. See, Martin taught us how that our movement, Martin's movement, the people's movement, was the beginning of the transformation of America. The issue is, do we want to transform, or do we want to take a chance on more bushes? All right? It was spiritual leadership that made us see that we're a sick society. It was spiritual leadership that made us see that we are too greedy as a nation. It was a spiritual leadership that made us see that our violence is the beginning of our death and destruction. Is that there was no other force that did that. In fact, we were not even saying it to ourselves. It was the civil rights movement that created the space that we could speak out and be heard on any issue we wanted to. Is that on war, before that, you couldn't couldn't speak out on war because you wouldn't be patriotic. Right? Before that, you couldn't speak out on racism because we know the purity of white, do we not? Right? You couldn't speak out on poverty because we know who would be on you because they were producing it. And it was more true in the greater the poverty, like in the South, the greater risk you had of talking against it. Is that you couldn't speak of peace because the whole idea of peace was against our foreign policy. Because the idea of war was the end result of our foreign policy. Because our foreign policy had to have a war going on in order to, there's only one reason for violence. You know what it is? To steal. You don't need violence unless you want to take something that somebody else has got. All right? And you can do it at the national level with wars, or you can just do it on the thug level. Right? But it's the same thing. And once this kind of language began to come as a normal conversation, when we begin to spread it all over the society, then we made millions of people who spoke out the very core of democracy for at least a half a century. Those standards that kept us from saying what we wanted to say, or another one was you're a communist. Is that, those were the kinds of things. What did the lady say they put on the stand back in that period and said, do you know who so-and-so is? And they were talking about Marx. Says, put a woman on who was leading a movement down in South Carolina, and a black woman, and said, tell us about Karl Marx. And she says, well, where does he live, sir? And nobody was concerned about communism. They were concerned about trying to have a decent life, right? Is that, but this was all ways of stopping. It became an excuse to kill rather than to allow people to really live properly. Martin took us from this petty personal concerns and little putting people against each other to a cosmic social consciousness. And we haven't forgotten it, or we wouldn't be here tonight. All right? Is that which can endure the most with the most people, if we're willing to move them, is nonviolence itself. Nobody really wants violence. They want the fruits of a nonviolent life. They want to argue out everything and should. They don't want to shoot it out. They want to argue it out, right? And good sense to prevail at the end of it is that Martin became the ideal model for the 20th century man, the model of a spiritual leader for the whole 21st century. We have lived with it, seen it, know it. It's only a matter of can we live up to it by acting it out. Is that I don't talk about nonviolence anymore. I talk about nonviolent direct action. And those should be one word because it's easy to talk nonviolence, but nobody understands what you're doing until you do it. All during the first part of the movement, we had difficulty getting people to come on board until, in fact, they saw us act. And in the middle of that action, they said they were coming on board. Did you notice how quickly, during that time, that the whole country became conscious of nonviolence? Because we were acting. How we won is because we were doing it. How did we do it? Because we were reaching their conscience. It is a necessary task that we have for this century as well. Rabbi Abraham Herschel was brought Martin King to a meeting of several hundred of his key rabbis across the country. One of the most influential rabbis of modern times. And he brought Martin and he introduced him this way. God has sent him to us. His presence is the hope of America. His mission is sacred. His leadership of supreme importance to every one of us. Martin King Jr. is a voice, a vision, a way. The whole future of America depends upon the impact and influence of Dr. King in the coming years. He is the prophet of our time. He is the spiritual leader. He is the model to follow and to understand third as we move to fulfill not his dream, but our dream of what a modern life can be. Because in the final analysis is that we must understand this, what Socrates understood is the unexamined life is not worth living. And here we are having a whole background for understanding the victories have already been won. All we have to do is follow through.